Good afternoon and welcome to the Free Market Foundation channel. Today is a very special day because we at the FMF are launching the Economic Freedom of the World report for 2023. We are partnering with the Fraser Institute in Canada, a world famous think tank that focuses on the state of economic freedom around the world. And I'm delighted to be joined here by Neil Emerick. He's a longtime associate of the FMF. Neil, welcome to the live stream.
Thank you.
So Neil has a very long history of involvement with the Economic Freedom of the World report and has quite a deep level of insight into the methodology behind it and has been tracking many of the variables that are measured in this report for some years now. And so is really the perfect person to be talking us through the latest findings of the EFW for 2023. We as the Free Market Foundation, we partner with the Fraser Institute. We are launching this together with a variety of other organizations around the world, and this is a live global launch. So Neil, let's maybe start at the beginning. Could you tell us?
A very good place to start.
Yeah. What is the EFW and why does it matter?
Right. Okay. Well, economic freedom is obviously very important to those that care about it, but the question is, how do you begin to measure it? So if you want to answer the question, how can we prove that economic freedom works? Then first you have to come up with a way of measuring it. So this question was posed by Milton Friedman and Michael Walker from the Fraser Institute back in 1975. But it took them until 1996 to really sort of narrow it down to some parameters that could be measured. So first of all, we wanted to just define what sort of philosophy they're trying to measure. So what is economic freedom as we're defining it? And it's really the right to choose a trade without undue regulation. You want secure property rights. You want a legal system with moderate taxes and frictionless interaction with people across borders. So, in terms of addressing trade. And then individuals basically then get to decide what, when, and how which products get produced rather than governments. So that's the sort of philosophy that was behind it. And then what they tried to do was create an index that would measure the degree to which government policies matched those ideals. And governments then enhance freedom when they support the individuals in their individual economic decision making. And of course, that economic freedom is reduced when governments are actually making those decisions for you. What the report is not, is it's not an ideological document. There's a temptation to think that obviously we're pushing an agenda here. But I could agree with Julius Malema what the difference is between a low taxing state and a high taxing state. So this is a number that we can get from the Government Statistics Office. How much tax does the government take? How much expenditure is there in the economy done by government? So we can see what percentage is government expenditure as a percentage of GDP and what is left over for the private sector to spend. And that's a very clear number. And we can agree what that number is. And then our ideology may determine whether we like a low taxing state or whether we like a high taxing state. But I think Mr. Malema and I can agree on the scale.
Yeah, you and Mr. Malema might disagree in terms of your interpretation about the normative values that you read into this data, but it's a fairly empirical methodology, right? Okay, and could you talk us through the way that the report is structured? What is the underlying methodology behind it? Because it is essentially a composite index, so it's also drawing on other indices. Could you maybe explain also the structure of it?
Sure. Okay, so there are 45 measurements that they're trying to amalgamate into this single value that represents economic freedom. So obviously that's quite a challenging project. But the way they've done it is they've in these 45 measures, they've categorized them into 5 blocks. You get a score in each of those 5 blocks, and then those blocks are averaged just to create the final score. So it's important to understand the 5 big categories. So the first one is size of government, and there we're looking at government consumption, we are looking at taxes, and we're looking at transfers across the economy. The second category is the legal system and the sort of property rights, and there we're looking at the judiciary, whether the courts are impartial, to what degree they'll enforce contracts, and the efficiency of the police. Obviously, that's very important for the protection of property and person. Sound money is the third category. You don't want a government that's corrupting your currency all the time. So excessive quantitative easing is obviously something you need to guard against. So we look at inflation, we look at money growth. Again, these numbers are readily available to everybody. And what you want is a government that's not printing money faster than the economy is growing. The fourth category is freedom to trade with foreigners. And we're looking at their friction between borders in terms of the flow of goods and the flow of people and capital, and whether the government is raising fences for those borders. And then the final category is regulation, which breaks down to three big subcategories of regulation of business, regulation of credit, and regulation of labor. Now, the data itself, the 45 measures, they're drawn from various other public reports. So these aren't surveys or data that the economic freedom fellows have put together. They're actually publicly available. So we hope in that respect that the report is considered very transparent in its methodology. The number of the reports are the World Bank Development Indicators, the Global Competitiveness Report, there's the International Country Risk Guide, and so on. So these are the sources for the numbers themselves.
IMF as well, I'd imagine. Yeah,
for sure. So the sort of country stats are drawn from those numbers. All the numbers are then put on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is a low freedom score, so we would expect high government intervention, and 10 is a free score where very, very little regulation. So we're looking at the sort of range of countries. They look at the range of marks. I mean, no government is taxing nothing. So they're usually somewhere between sort of 15% and potentially 50, 60%. So within that range, we're creating a scale of 1 to 10. The index itself has now been going for 25 years. So there's quite a lot of data. We've got a lot of data for the year, but we've also got longitudinal data over that period. So we can see how countries are changing over time, which is quite exciting. And the purpose of the index is ultimately to try and show that economic freedom matters. And we now have over 600 academic papers that correlate economic freedom with economic outcomes that we would think of as good outcomes.
Okay, well, let's run with that. Why does economic freedom matter? What does it mean to have a high correlation of economic freedom with other variables, for example, like economic growth? Do we see those relationships, those causal relationships?
And that's so important. I mean, that's the purpose of the index really, is if you're going to draw a graph, you want X on the left and Y on the right, and economic freedom on the bottom and something else on the left. And this is where it gets interesting. So what they typically do, just to make the presentation of the data a little bit more palatable, is that they divide the 160 countries in the index into quartiles. And then we can look at the lowest freedom ranking, the sort of high interventionist governments, and compare that to the top quartile, which would be the mostly free countries. So if I look at income per capita as a statistic, and we correlate that with the economic freedom score, the bottom quartile will typically earn $6,300 a year. So that's 6,300. The top quartile of economically free countries, they will earn $48,000 a year. So that is 7.6 times higher than the lowest group. Now, one of the accusations that we would probably get from the left is that as you have a free and open economy, that the income inequality becomes an issue in society, that the top guys are earning all the money and the laborers aren't. Unfortunately, that's not borne out, or fortunately, that's not borne out by the statistics. So one number that's interesting is the income share of the poorest 10%. How much of the pie do the bottom 10% get? And that is basically about 2.75% across all countries. It seems to be sort of an absolute number that's very difficult to shake. It's 2.75% of the population as a whole. And it doesn't matter what economic freedom score you have, that is the sort of generalized number. So it's quite an interesting thing that the Gini coefficient does not correlate well with economic freedom, which we would take as a positive. What is much, much more important is the fact that the income earned by the poorest 10% is significantly correlated with economic freedom. So the bottom quartile of countries, if you live in one of those countries, then as a poor person, you will earn $1,700 a year. But if you live in one of the higher income countries and you're in the poorest 10% in that high income country, then you would earn $14,000 a year. So if you're going to be poor, you will be 8 times better off if you live in an economically free country, if you happen to be on the bottom rung sort of thing.
So if you had to say to a person, would you rather be poor in a free country, or would you rather be poor in an unfree country?
Correct.
You're going to be 8 times more wealthy, even if you're in the bottom 10% of the population.
It's a stunning number, yeah.
If you are in a rich country.
Related to that is actually they've correlated economic freedom with border crossings. So you don't see people going from Miami to Cuba or North Korea to South Korea. It's always in the other direction.
Yeah.
So that would explain why then we see which direction poor people like to travel into. The other thing is, if you live in the bottom quartile, you're only going to live to 65 on average. If you live in one of the economically free countries, you're going to live to 81. So 20 odd years more, that you're going to live. At the other end of the scale, infant mortality, if you're in the bottom quartile, 39 out of 1,000 babies will not live to see the age of 5. In an economically free country, that number drops to 4 in 1,000. So that, again, is 10 times difference in a social outcome. There's also something called the Social Progress Index, which is not just economic outcomes, but it measures general well-being. The index number for the bottom quartile is 54, and that's 85 for people in the top countries. And then the one I enjoy the most is the UN World Happiness Index. So we've got a lot of economic stats and health, wealth, prosperity there, but are you happier if you live in an economically free country? The answer is positively yes. The bottom quartile score 4.61 on the UN Happiness Index, whereas the free countries, you get a score of high of 6.76 out of 10 there. So you live longer, you're wealthier, you're healthier, and you're a lot happier. So across the board, almost every economic indicator for social well-being correlates positively with economic freedom.
Okay, so it's not just that the graph for GDP per capita is going up for the free countries, also the general welfare and flourishing of the populace is increasing. But why do you think that there is this correlation? Why does freedom lead to these very advantageous outcomes?
Why do we think freedom matters? I mean, I think that's the question at the heart of the issue. So governments will always struggle. I mean, we've had the debate of, did communism and capitalism went head to head, and we saw that capitalism worked. Why did it work? I think because there's the flourishing of the individual, as you put it. The becoming of an individual who can make those choices is so much more powerful than having a single bureaucrat in Pretoria making those decisions for you. People are able to process information at the grassroots and change their consuming behavior, their production behavior. They can look to see what's happening in the economy, and they can obviously adjust. And that's an economy that can react, is dynamic, is flourishing, it's growing, and it's constantly prosperous. One that has a constant heavy hand of government just does not react as successfully.
No, absolutely. Well, we're getting very philosophical here, but we need to also zoom in on some of the results because I think they're really fascinating. So maybe you could take us through some of the headline findings. And I would encourage our audience as well. After the stream, we'll put a link to the full report in the pinned comment and also in the description, so you can dive into all the data yourself. But Neil, why don't you take us through some of the high-level findings?
Okay, this is where you give me the drum roll. We have a change in the top slot for the first time ever. Hong Kong has historically been always #1 in the ranking, but we know that China has been interfering more and more with the politics of Hong Kong, and they've now dropped below Singapore. Singapore now takes the top slot. They've been second since the index began. But the two have swapped positions, and it'll be very interesting to track the progress of Hong Kong over the next 5 to 10 years and just see how much impact the Chinese government is going to have there. But in terms of the top 10, we have Singapore, Hong Kong, Switzerland, New Zealand, United States, and then Ireland, Denmark, Australia, the UK, and Canada. They form the most economically free countries in the world. On the bottom 10, we will not have any surprises there, but it's the same crew. It's the Republic of Congo, Algeria, Argentina, Libya, Iran, Yemen, Sudan, Syria, our neighbor Zimbabwe, and of course, bottom of the pile is Venezuela.
And the industrialized nations, the G7, how do they fare?
Yeah, just to get a sort of a generalized band there. So the sort of the bigger countries, the UK is 9th, as we mentioned, Italy is 53rd, the United States is 5th, Germany is 23rd, France is 47th. So Germany and France are sort of there in the middle brackets, whereas the UK, the Anglo-Saxon countries, Canada as well, they're 10th. Japan is 20th.
Okay, and then obviously very recently, last month, in fact, we had the Brics conference. There was a lot of fanfare. I got caught in many traffic jams in Sandton, blue light brigades everywhere. And there was the expansion of the Brics. It's now, I guess, Brics Plus. But how do these immediate peers within the Brics group fare? I mean, I think South Africa is in the median there in terms of its freedom ranking, but what about some of the others?
Right, well, here we go. So of the original Brics countries, India is the best. It's 87th, so it's best of a poor pack. Brazil is 90th, right next door. Russia is 104th. China is 111th in terms of economic freedom. And the big reveal, South Africa's ranking this year is one place lower from 93 to 94. So we are very much aligned with India, Brazil, and Russia there in the pack, the sort of ranked to 90s to 100s in the country list. Interesting if we look at the new countries that have been offered membership in Brics, the best one is the United Arab Emirates. They are currently 50th in the ranking. But the rest of the crew that have been invited form a sort of a sorry lot. It's Saudi Arabia's at 83rd, Egypt is 144th, Ethiopia is 145th, Argentina is 158th, they're third bottom, and Iran is 160th. So the countries that are joining are not exactly an economically free state of, have a state of affairs there. So I'm not sure what economic benefit that's going to bring through to us.
And we'll get more deeply into South Africa's performance, but what about regionally in terms of the continent? I think South Africa is ranked number 10 out of the African countries that were ranked in the index, which seems a little bit low to me given the size of our GDP. How did some of the other African peer countries do?
Well, that's right. It's very distressing to think South Africa, that had that sort of very, free economy and a very, very productive economy, is now falling behind economic freedom into the other younger countries of Africa. The younger in demographic, and they're coming through, and the policies are starting to change. It's getting very, very exciting. If we count Mauritius, it is the most economically free country, which technically falls into our geography. So they're at 15 on the scale. I think that's borne out. They're building a very strong financial industry. They're jettisoning their sort of sugar industries, and they're looking for capital to move across their borders and become an investment destination for the region. So a lot of good stuff happening there in Mauritius. But in terms of the other countries that are closer to us on the continent, Botswana is at 77th, Kenya is 78th, and Rwanda is 80th. So they're sort of 10, 12 rankings above South Africa. Nigeria is above South Africa now. That didn't used to be the case. They are now at 81st. They were sort of about 100, 110, 120 several years ago. Tanzania is at 105th. Namibia is 113. Zimbabwe is 164. And as you said, South Africa is 10th in Africa at 94.
Okay, so quite an uneven performance there across Africa. And I think that underscores what we often say, that Africa is not this homogenous place. There's different geographies, different political and economic systems. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there in many respects.
Yeah, I think we can't say that any of those countries are particularly economically free, but what has happened over the last few years is that they've moved from being very unfree to slightly more free. Okay. So there is certainly a trend in the direction there that we're pleased about. So let's just hope that continues.
And what about some of the laggards who are on the bottom of the list? Who's doing badly?
Going back to the bottom of the list there, sorry, we had the Republic of Congo, Algeria, and Argentina. I mean, Argentina's been struggling for years. They just cannot seem to get out of that Peronist, socialist mindset. So it's very interesting to see that they have a libertarian candidate running for the presidency in the next couple of months. So that's going to be a shock to the Argentinian system. The other countries seem to be mostly at war. Libya, Yemen, Sudan, Syria. That's a pretty bad state. You're not going to have much economic activity while the bombs are going off. But Zimbabwe and Venezuela, that is a story of their own making. I mean, they have chosen particular policies and highly interventionist, currency destroying, and have reaped the results. We saw Venezuela drop from sort of around the mid-50s mark, and it was rapidly dropping over 5 years. And for several talks when we did these presentations, we kept predicting that Venezuela was going to hit rock bottom, and that's pretty much happened now. And we're seeing Venezuelans are leaving the country in droves. We're seeing that they weigh 10 kilograms less than they did 10 years ago, the average weight of the population. I mean, there's serious issues going on there that, would unfortunately are a result of the policies they've chosen.
Yeah, and then our neighboring Zimbabwe as well, also a cautionary tale, as you say. And I think what's very interesting in both of those examples is how the principle of sound money was really violated on a very extreme level, and how that ripples out throughout the rest of the system, and ends up creating knock-on effects for other freedom indicators. Obviously, the rule of law issue is also honored only in the breach in those two countries. So I think that's quite lamentable. And I think for something that relatively free societies like our own should look to as something to avoid. All right. And any other data trends that really stand out to you, Neil?
Yeah, I thought it might be helpful just to sort of see how the world might perceive us when this index is released. So who are South Africa's peers? So what I've done here is I've just taken the countries that are sort of 3 positions below South Africa and 3 positions above South Africa, just to get a sense of what kind of a country are we? Who are we being compared to when an international investor is looking at us? We're not unique. We're not a special case. We really do fall into a certain category. So who do we look like? I think that's quite instructive. So if I look at the EFW ranking as a figure, as I've said, we come 94th. So the countries that are just either side of us, sandwiching us, are Brazil, Oman, Qatar, Bahamas, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Morocco, Benin, Ghana, and Tajikistan. So that's our kind of investment kind of partners that we're talking about, which is not exactly a sort of a nice peer group to be walking in. It's also sometimes difficult to look at a very small country maybe and say, well, that set of policies would not apply to us because they don't have a big population or something. So, the countries that are around South Africa's size are Thailand, France, the UK, Tanzania, Italy, Kenya, and Colombia. Colombia, I point out, that's 89th on the ranking. Colombia and South Africa seem to share the same ranking on almost everything, actually. So I think it's an ideal country. And if we don't want to be Colombia, then we should change our policies. Yeah, close GDP, we do about $400 billion a year in GDP. So comparative economies of things like Thailand, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Denmark, Romania.
And that's national GDP, that's the aggregate GDP, not GDP per capita.
Correct. So if we look at the GDP per capita, then South African peers are Belize, Thailand, Albania, Libya, Colombia, Georgia, and Ecuador. So in terms of the economies and in terms of the sort of ranking and everything, South Africa is very much sort of a boring middle income, average corruption, poor policies, not quite reaching that global status of a free trade economy. We're very much in that boring middle group, sadly.
But yeah, if we want to address our extreme levels of poverty, the frustrated aspirations of many millions of South Africans, we have to be aiming higher. We need to be improving our freedom score. But maybe we could just delve into South Africa in a bit more detail. And you mentioned those different tranches, those different subcategories. So maybe we could just go through those one by one. So the first one you mentioned, and just bearing in mind South Africa is 94 out of 165. Our overall score is 6.53. That's out of 10, as you mentioned, the 1 to 10. So we have declined in relative terms, relative to our peers, and also in absolute terms. That score is, I think, the second lowest score we've had since 2000. And in 2000, we were ranked 47th.
Correct.
So if you zoom out, the overall trajectory is negative, even though our change year on year has been fairly marginal. And I think that period in the early 2000s reflected a much greater degree of openness, economic liberalization, monetary policy was getting under control, fiscal policy was a lot more conservative under the Mbeki and Manuel years. So yeah, let's maybe go through, first of all, the size of government. How does South Africa perform there on the rankings?
Okay, so I've got the individual rankings per category, but I thought it's also quite instructive to see who are our peers at that level as well. So where do we and who do we compare to? So we rank 119th out of 165 for size of government. We have a large government. It has a large hand in the economy. It spends a large amount of the GDP. And relative peers would be countries like Tanzania, Hungary, Qatar, Bolivia, Russia, and interestingly, Australia. Large size of government, interestingly, is also fairly well correlated with the economically free countries. You do see high levels of government spend in places like Sweden, Denmark, the UK. So we can come back to that one about how important it is as a contributor to the economic freedom. But just the kind of numbers that are in that category are things like the general government consumption. That's an easy number. That's the percentage of government spend as a proportion of the economy as a whole. The other interesting one is the top marginal tax rate. Now, that's an interesting one because the top marginal tax rate in the US is 37%, but it only kicks in at $580,000 a year income. So that's 11 million Rand a year salary that you'd need before you start paying the top tax rate. So that just puts in perspective the fact that in South Africa, you will earn the top tax rate or pay the top tax rate of 45%, which kicks in at 1.8 million. So that's at $95,000 a year, just for comparison, compared to 580,000. So they are comparing countries directly there to see, you know, at what point does the top rate tax kick in? We would be relatively poor in America, and yet you'd be paying the top tax rate here. So that's an interesting one. Government debt in South Africa is now at 5.4 trillion Rand. So each and every citizen in South Africa owes 90,000 Rand to itself, which we have to pay back. So that's up to 71% of our GDP now. So this is a very important number that we obviously has made the news a lot recently. So
a lot of that, sorry to interrupt, Neil, a lot of that government borrowing is actually going towards government consumption. So just paying the salaries of civil servants. It's not being invested in infrastructure or anything like that. So this is not Keynesian
stimulus.
Yeah, this is just keeping
the lights
government
on salaries.
going.
Yeah, it's salaries and wages, free student loans, social grants. There's a lot of transfers going on, a lot of wastage. So I mean, we spend nearly 34% of our GDP on is government choice of expenditure, and they're not choosing the right things. The second category, probably the most important one. Any country that fails with this particular category is a basket case. So this one is almost necessary and sufficient. Well, sorry, not sufficient, but necessary. If you don't have a strong legal system and a defense of property rights, or the institutions that defend property rights, then you almost have nothing. So other surveys have shown that this category is extremely important. It covers things like property rights, courts, whether they are impartial or not, whether they will enforce a contract, and also the efficiency of the police. You know, to what degree can you depend on the police to protect your person and your property? We rank reasonably well here. It's our best score. We are 59th in the world in our judicial system, which, you know, we do fairly well on the structure of the courts and the decisions that they make and so on. So our courts are relatively left alone at this point. So they're relatively impartial. So we do reasonably well in this category. It's a saving grace. I think we obviously will see where we do much poorly. Our peers, to understand what kind of court system would we be compared to: Bulgaria, Panama, Barbados, Namibia, Malaysia, Montenegro. Malaysia you'll see come up a few times. We're a very similar size country and a similar set of policies, so that they will repeat. The danger, of course, is that we will start dropping in those rankings if we continue with policies such as expropriation without compensation. Our police, we receive a terrible, terrible score on our police. It's 2.1 out of 10. If you can't, you know, generally enforce security and protection of private property, then, you know, you can't invest in business, you can't invest in capital. So that's one to watch. It's our best score at the moment, but one that, you know, we have to watch.
Okay, so there's a law and order component to that as well as the rule of law, which is transparent rules that apply equally to all citizens, regardless of their power or status.
Correct. We don't want to become a gangster state. That number will show up very clearly, and is a very, very important one, because without that, you've got nothing.
Yeah, that's why, as the Free Market Foundation, we have two significant initiatives in both the rule of law, our rule of law project, which is designed to uphold and maintain the rule of law, often enter into public interest litigation to defend that very important principle. And then on property rights, we have the Kaya Lum project, which seeks to extend title deeds to disadvantaged South Africans who may reside on a property but don't have the legal mechanisms to prove their ownership status. So in that sense, as the FMF, we really feel like these two principles, private property rights and the rule of law, are worth defending and advancing.
And as the FMF has now transferred over, what, 50,000 properties into freehold title with more?
10,000.
10,000, okay. So, but I mean, those are 10,000 people now with a vested interest in property. So we will hope that the courts are still there to help protect them, own it into the future.
Yeah, essential.
The third category then is sound money. Obviously hugely important for economic calculation. If the government is messing with the value of your currency, that's a real problem. They can do that by printing money. They do that by buying government bonds indirectly and just flooding the country with an increased money aggregates. So in this particular category, we're looking at the inflation rate, we're looking at the growth in the money aggregates, and what we're really looking at is whether the money supply is growing faster than the economy. You know, why are we having so much money growing if the economy is not growing? And South Africa has produced 35% more currency in the last 3 years than our economy has grown, and our economy hasn't grown. So why do we have 35% more money? That's showing up as inflation. We've never, I mean, we think of 6% inflation as relatively moderate in South African history terms, but it's still an extremely high level of inflation. I mean, where the rest of the world has been experiencing 0 or 1, 2%, you know, at least you can sort of work with that. But 6% is still a significant corruption of your money. Just to put that into perspective, if you save away for 15 years, the savings that you make are halved in those 15 years at 6% inflation. So it can be very, very corrupting. Now, we scored 95 on that ranking, so it's kind of, again, in the middling thing. Our peers would be Bosnia, Kuwait, Macedonia, Malaysia again, Colombia, and Poland. So again, we've not got a good track record, but we're not the worst in the world. So that's good.
And relatively speaking, the South African Reserve Bank is fairly well governed in terms of South African government institutions. It has independence, has a constitutional mandate, and yet we still see these pressures from various political quarters to try and increase the scope of the SARB's mandate to deal with things like unemployment, and also a lot of pressure from kind of radical leftist groups to increase the monetary supply, and COSATU as well, which is an alliance partner. What are some of the dangers of that if you start meddling with the autonomy of the monetary system?
Well, the only decent value of inflation is 0. I mean, people can work around that, and there's no sort of, you know, transfers going on across the economy from debtors to creditors. So how the Reserve Bank manages that is obviously extremely complex, but if it's wrong, I think, to target 5 or a range of 4 to 6%. The mandate of the Reserve Bank is to protect the value of the currency. And really then the only correct number for that would be 0% inflation. So they are currently independent. I don't think there's a real policy momentum to change anything. I feel reasonably confident that the Reserve Bank will remain independent. However, I don't think that they are a great performer. I think the level of inflation that South Africa has experienced over the years, we can see that in the depreciation of the rand. The depreciation of the rand pretty much correlates with our inflation rate differential with America and our other trading peers. 6% is not good enough. We have to do better.
Yeah, I agree. All right, what's next?
Right, well, we move on to the fourth category, which is freedom to trade. South Africa scores 103 here. This was an area that we used to do much, much better in, but the borders have been raised. Our peers in this sector are people like like Indonesia, Suriname, Mozambique, Tunisia, Russia, and Lesotho. So we're not looking good as a trading nation. We have historically done better. The statistics that we're monitoring in this category are things like tariffs. So when a government is taxing products that are coming over the borders, we can monitor the level of those taxes. So you may have 5% across the board as a custom tax, and that's one of the numbers that we look at. But the other number that's much more important is the deviation in tariffs. So there we're looking at whether they're putting 5% on chickens and 15% on cement and 50% on cars. Because if there's a huge variation in tariffs, then the government is cherry picking across the economy which industries they want to thrive, or let's say more practically, which suppliers they're trying to protect. So you have less economic freedom if there's a high level of tariff deviation, because then the government's got his hand in there. It's political discretion. There's corruption in there. There's lobbying that's going on in there, and it shouldn't matter. A low tax, which is applicable to all good, is a revenue earner. If it deviates, then obviously there's industrial policy at work, and that never works.
And we also have quite high levels of subsidization for key industries like the automotive sector. Is that won't really show up there? We're not monitoring that one there. Although non-tariff trade barriers is something that's monitored, so that might be hiding in there. There's a very interesting one this year. So South Africa still struggles as well with capital control. So we talk about products crossing borders. Money also crosses borders. South Africans still really can't hold a foreign bank account domestically. We can't own a foreign bank account and hold dollars as a local currency. We have been allowed to own currency accounts overseas now. But capital controls, every single time you move money across, you have to fill in a form with the bank, and that goes to the Reserve Bank. So there's still not clear, transparent ability to move our own money around. But it's your money.
It's our money, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now, the one very interesting statistic that's changed across the board for all countries is a parameter called the freedom of foreigners to visit. Now, South Africa obviously has a great tourism industry, and we always had the capacity of freedom for foreigners to come and visit South Africa in terms of visas and so on. But many, many countries scored a 0 this year in the year of the report, which was 2021, because it formed the end of the COVID period, where literally the borders were shut down to international tourists. So this was an absolute anomaly. And I assume that all the countries sank this year because of it. And then hopefully their average scores will go up again next year marginally when they restore the
We neglected to mention, actually, as part of the methodological discussion, that there is a lag in this data. So this is the 2023 report, but the data is aggregated from 2021.
Correct. Yeah, we need a couple of years just to get all the data, have the various governments correct the data. But by the time it's then compiled 6 months before now, people then check the data, but then we're able to produce the results. So there is always that lag. One of the policy debates that's hitting the news right now is localization and BEE, and it's such a dangerous policy, and it's going to have such an impact on this particular score. It makes absolutely no sense for me to make my own clothes and grow my own food. I would not do that as a person. I have a white collar job, and that's what I do, and I leave the sort of growing of potatoes to other people. The same thing applies to countries. There's such an opportunity for countries to develop larger industries and to specialize, and then attack the global market. Whereas if we try and do it ourselves, why would we do that? I mean, why would we have to create these little tiny pockets of protected industries that we put these barriers up to? We won't let the other imports come in, and it only harms us. I mean, it may protect a few suppliers, but it harms everybody else in the economy, and it also stops us from going through the processes of developing industries that are truly global and can develop scale and compete on the global stage. So I think that's an area that we have to monitor. It's something that will affect the scores, and it will ultimately impact on the aggregates, the number that we're going to have to watch.
Yeah, and I think instead of trying to ram localization through as a policy, we should be having a conversation about what is South Africa's true comparative advantage, that idea that David Ricardo, the Scottish economist, developed many hundreds of years ago. Where can we find our competitive niche? And I would say that that's in minerals, in tourism, as you mentioned, agriculture. Those are the industries we should be leaning into hard. We can't really make an iPhone in South Africa, but maybe we can make one of the small components.
Maybe we can make apps, you don't know. Eskom Sepush, we celebrated last night as an unsung hero. So there we have a fabulous software industry in South Africa.
Human capital as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, and then finally, we have the category of regulation. This is one that impacts on South Africa substantially, of course. So we're looking at the regulation of labour, of business and credit. Overall, we are ranked 91. So again, very much middle of the road. Our peers in this category would be Moldova, the Ivory Coast, Papua New Guinea, Mexico, Greece, Uganda. So that's kind of where the red tape level, who our peers are. We do very, very well in the ownership of banks. almost all the banks in South Africa are privately owned. So that we get a 10 out of 10 ranking on that number. We get a very low ranking on private sector credit. That's a number which divides the government's debt relative to the private sector's debt. So what's that ratio? And our ratio is quite high on the government debt side. So they take up a large portion of the savings in the country. So we get a score of 2.6 out of 10 on that ranking. We've always historically done very poorly in hiring and firing regulations. We have a strong collective bargaining process, which puts us absolute bottom of the rankings. A new one called flexible wage determination. We score 4.11 on that score. That's minimum wages. So we are at the rock bottom in the labour area. We have a very, very inflexible labour market, and we get a very, very bad score in that section.
And that is directly correlated with our very high levels of unemployment. And that's a reflection of
we would say so, yeah.
The political economy.
I don't buy the argument that there's just structural something inherent in the South African economy that people can't get employed. These are policies that we have chosen. We've chosen to support the sort of unionized labor and the collective bargaining process, and it has had a corresponding impact on employment. So that's a real problem. The freedom to compete is a new category. So they have something called market openness, which is quite nice, which measures how easy is it to open a business, and then how easy is it to operate that business. Now, interestingly, they aggregate those two numbers together. So opening a business is actually quite easy in South Africa. You want to open a PTY company, it's quite quick. We get through in 10 days, 2 weeks, you've got a business. But we don't do so well on the freedom to compete score. So immediately we have UIF and SDL and other regulations and VATs and all the other things that we have to comply with. So the regulation area immediately imposes itself on small companies. So that we get a 5.3 out of 10. And then there's a survey result that says what level of distortion is there in the business environment. We get a 3.75 on that score based on the price controls and the state controls that are sort of interfering on the sort of businesses there. So those are areas that the president has said he would address in terms of red tape, but it clearly is not showing up yet. There's no addressable movement in these indexes. The policies that impact in this area are black economic empowerment as a redistributive policy, especially as it applies to enforcement with international investors. It's not a welcome practice. Very, very difficult to encourage investors to come if they have to hand over shares to someone else or be told how their businesses are going to run. Minimum wages is a crime in terms of the employment we have in this country. It's not helping anybody. It needs to be scrapped. And collective bargaining is still an extremely rigid process in this country. And those agreed policies formed from 51% of from the companies involved are then imposed on companies that were not part of that bargaining process. That seems grossly unfair. We need to liberalize those sections of the economy and open it up.
Okay, well, if the government wants to see its freedom score improve, then it just needs to look at its own policies. And it seems like we are constraining ourselves and limiting our own potential, which I think often in some of these conversations, there's a sense of helplessness that many people have, like, oh, well, like you mentioned, unemployment. This is just a feature of South African life, and woe is us, what are we to do about it? But actually the power is in our hands to change these circumstances.
It is, and this is very much the foot that the government is shooting, they're our own foot. These are self-imposed policies. We cannot claim that these are external factors that are affecting South Africa. We cannot blame China. We cannot blame the US. So most of these policies have been predicted. They've been brought to the public attention by the Free Market Foundation. People can go read the articles on all the various policy sections, and we can say, if you do this, this will likely happen. And I think the Economic Freedom of the World report is so good for producing almost a mathematical definition of what we define to be freedom and whether it's going to correlate with the outcomes that we are predicting. So Julius Malema is free to go and do his same predictions and see if countries with low levels of economic freedom produce good outcomes, and he will not come to different results.
Right. Well, Neil, I think as we just bring this live stream to a close, maybe you could just conclude with a few general observations and thoughts for where South Africa is going and the choices that confront us in the near future.
Well, I'd like to use a quote from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. So that story opens with the line, happy families are all alike, but unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And I think that's instructive about, you know, economic freedom as it applies to different countries, because South Africa has a unique history. You know, we were a colony involved in mineral extraction. We had the policy of apartheid for many, many years. We are a multilingual, multicultural society. So we're absolutely unique in many regards. We are sitting at the bottom of a huge, you know, geographic continent, miles away from our trading partners. So there are very, very specific parameters which our government has to address. However, we can't ignore what successful nations have in common. They offer strong protection of property rights and enforcement of contracts. They use personal choice as the allocation mechanism in the economy instead of government decision-making, voluntary exchange, and the freedom to enter markets globally and to compete. So that's what we want to be looking at. What do the successful nations do, and can we emulate that? Now, you know, how has South Africa fared over the last 20 years? So in 2000, as you mentioned earlier, we were ranked 47th. So 94th is a clear trend down, and in a way has reflected the government's stated policy of creating a developmental state. So if they are attempting to build a development state, we are very happy to confirm that they have achieved it and that they now have a high level of intervention in the economy, as predicted by the score, and they are now reaping the results. We are mediocre as an investment destination. We do not respect property rights. We do not foster an economic environment that is flexible. We have a government that spends too much. It borrows too much to afford that spend, and they do not spend it on capital investment. They're spending it on bloated wages. So that is an issue that I don't think can be left aside anymore. People ask, are we a failed state? And the answer to that is no, we are not there yet. At ranking 94, we are merely a failing state, but we have not failed yet. However, the debt crisis is really coming now as a day of reckoning. This can has been kicked along the road really as far, but we have now run out of tar road. In fact, the can is now sitting in a pothole. So we actually have to address this thing. The government has now run out of money. So the government is going to make some very, very hard choices now, which is interesting. I don't think the ANC, as the government in power, is unlikely to change their tack in the next 6 months because we have an election coming up. So that's going to be very problematic to do anything in the next 12 months. But I think the voting public have to very, very carefully scrutinise the options that are being put on the table by the various parties. They have to take a critical look at what policies are being offered and what successful countries do. And we want to emulate those. You know, the numbers are there. There's now 30 years of data. People can go and look at the policies and they can evaluate this. And what they should be aiming for, to look for policies that are free market driven, openness to trade, a light touch on the regulation, and an absolute commitment to the entrepreneurial spirit. If we can achieve that, then we will create jobs, we'll create growth, and we will finally get the prosperous South Africa that we really want.
Well, Neil, Emerick, I wanted to thank you very much for an insightful conversation. I would encourage our audience to check out the Economic Freedom of the World report. There's a link down in the description and in the pinned comment where you can delve into the data yourself. My name is David Ansara, joining you from a very windy and rainy Hart Bay in Cape Town. It's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you, Neil, and I think we at the Free Market Foundation are incredibly lucky to have you as an associate of our organization, and very privileged to be able to tap into your knowledge, particularly in this domain. I think it's a very important conversation to have, and freedom is within our grasp, and we just need to reach out and grab it. So thank you once again.
Thank you.